Alright YouTube, it's the perfect atmosphere for an occult video, so occult video number 34, specifically on the concept of Vermont cryptids, Vermont paranormal stuff. Uh, Might as well make a video on the topic because, living in Vermont you become familiar with some of the stories that circulate around. Pro tip, I do not necessarily take them all seriously. I am a true skeptic when it comes to any specific accounts regarding cryptids or anything like that. Which is to say, I don't say, well, it's a bunch of nonsense. That's not a skeptic, that's a denialist. But I'm not going to go into studying any of these things assuming that they're true either. I approach them from a more academic perspective. I do believe in spiritual things. I do believe at least some of these cryptids exist in some form or another. I like to believe that in many cases you've got some underlying explanation for the story. Some of them go to what we would consider, prehistoric times or antiquity around the world. Here in Vermont, you would have native lore, and then you would have colonial lore, and then sort of the industrial Victorian eras, and then into modernity. Things change over time. Michelle Murger's own work, The Cross-Cultural Analysis of Lake Monsters, again, as I've mentioned before, is the best possible thing that you can read regarding at least aquatic cryptids in North America, especially Canada, some parts of New England, the sort of Great Lakes region. That's really what it covers. It goes into some detail in Europe as well, though, because it's cross-cultural. The most famous cryptid, of course, that we've got here in Vermont is Champ, which is also claimed by New York and Canada because Lake Champlain happens to traverse all three areas. And Champ is erroneously attested to by Samuel D. Champlain. However, the report that Champlain gives, of course the lake is named after him because he's the first colonial figure to discover it. He's talking about large fish, about sturgeon in his own account. He says nothing about a lake monster, a dragon or horse's head or any of these other things. It's an erroneous account that's often alluded to. People here in Vermont or over in New York or up in Canada or whatever, they make the same mistake. They parrot this line of, oh, well, Samuel D. Champlain hundreds of years ago saw Champ. No, he didn't. He saw large fish that we now identify as sturgeon, which may indeed be the underlying basis for the Lake Champlain monster. I've said before, some of the sightings of things in Lake Champlain suggest that, if it's not some sort of a freshwater whale that evolved after the area became locked off from the ocean, then we're dealing probably with at least one abnormally large sturgeon, probably multiple abnormally large sturgeons of some sort. We're talking 15 plus feet, and we do know that there are occasional sturgeon capable of getting to that size. Now, a lake sturgeon, the kind you would see in the sea, it is entirely possible that a breeding population has taken hold there. It is possible for that to have happened through the process of evolution. Do I think that there's some sort of dragon slumbering in Lake Champlain? No, obviously not. That wouldn't make much sense. Do I think it has anything to do with the occult, strictly speaking? Not necessarily, not to a great extent. You got some spooky stuff around the lake. It is a spooky location, typical New England forests. Autumn comes, trees change color, they get barren, there's pumpkins everywhere, and everyone wants to tell these fright stories. Ultimately, though, if we look back at the earliest encounter of anything strange in the lake that people themselves by the thousands often allude to, from Champlain, from the first so-called sophisticated cultured white man who happened to discover the area, he's talking about sturgeon. Well, many of the sightings, you get some tourist visiting Lake Champlain who's used to living in an urban environment where fish are, already cut up and in the grocery aisle. Yes, if they see a 10-foot long sturgeon, they're going to think it's a sea monster of some sort. They're going to go crazy. They've never seen anything like it. Especially, if they went out to sea and they saw something large, it's, oh, a whale. Oh, a shark. Oh, a dolphin. A bunch of dolphins or something. But if they see it in a lake where, the sharks and whales and stuff are sort of foreign elements, they're not going to be aware of the fact that it's a sturgeon. If they knew that there were 10-foot sturgeon probably fairly routinely in Lake Champlain, chances are they wouldn't even swim there. Or muskies or pike or something like that. Some of these larger species that really can get rather gigantic. People don't seem to understand that they even exist in the first place. Another famous sort of legend we've got is up in the Stowe area in the Devil's Wash Bowl called Pigman. And Pigman is supposedly some deformed child at some point in far history, the 1800s, the 1700s, whatever, gets born. It's sort of a Jersey Devil scenario. It's roughly comparable to that story. You have this rather forsaken crater-looking area up near Stowe. It's very remote. There are a few settlements around it. And it appears to have come forth as a sort of urban legend to keep high schoolers in the area from going out in the woods to smoke and fuck each other and party in general. Specifically, it seems that it was spawned specifically as a sort of cautionary tale to keep them out of the woods at night and doing things they shouldn't do. Then several people at various times have taken it seriously enough. They do go out in the woods. They get frightened by an owl or by a coyote howling or something. They see a bear or whatever, and they go off running. Their cigarettes smoke trailing behind them, of course. And they say, "Oh, the Pigman came after us," or something. It's like the Goat Man. It's like the Jersey Devil. These, in many cases, appear to be cautionary tales. Or they're spun from the same general fabric of mythology. That I don't take the Pigman seriously. That's not one of the stories that I would say has any bearing on reality. Oddly enough, this specific state, probably because we don't have a lot of large flat areas conducive to crop circles and stuff, we have relatively little in the way of UFO lore. Anything revolving around crop circles. It's sort of absent from our state. You've got to realize most of this state is composed of mountains and sloping hills, very rural areas, not the sort of land that is typically farmed outside of the Champlain Valley and some of these rather small intermountain valleys that crisscross the state. Much of our land is too mountainous to really farm to any great degree. You can grow trees on it for lumber. You'd have an orchard or something like that. But as far as growing a large number of grains or something like that, that typically that's where you get the crop circles. You just don't have it. I always find it funny. These crop circles almost invariably appear in grain fields, usually corn, sometimes like wheat or sorghum. Have you ever seen a crop circle constructed in a cabbage field or in an asparagus field or any of these other fields? For some reason, the ETs that are up there trying to communicate with us really like grain. They really maybe they're just here to steal corn. They're like some of the local kids infiltrating one of the local fields to get some free food that they can roast or eat with their barbecue or something like that. It's very funny to me. We've also got the typical Emily's Bridge sort of story. Ours is one of the older ones. But if you even check the anecdotal reports, like you go to the Shadowlands Haunted Index, which hasn't been updated in years, but it's still comprehensive for the most part. It does have most of the major paranormal locations are listed there for each state and certain other countries. There are tens of thousands of different anecdotal reports there. If you go there and you traverse these different states and look at the haunted locations thereupon, you'll find that the basic story of the sort of out-of-the-way, usually a covered bridge if you're here, one of the older, the wooden covered bridges, other railroad bridges and stuff in other states. The story morphs as it moves across the United States. In the sort of industrial center, the Rust Belt, you're getting railroad bridges. Here you've got covered bridges. Down south you'd have maybe a highway overpass or something. Out west it'd be different. All these stories share the same basic facet. There's a bridge somewhere in a remote or semi-remote location. A couple of young lovers are supposed to meet there. One of them dies en route. The other one kills themselves. And now every Halloween or every third night or every full moon or every what other period of time you can think of. You can see them on the bridge or get chased by them. Sometimes they die in a car wreck near the bridge, and you have sort of the gravity hills. This is a similar sort of feature of these hills that are really optical illusions, which always spawn the same mythology about Civil War soldiers or local kids that got killed on a railroad crossing or something pushing your car to get you out of the way. They're all hoaxes, or not hoaxes so much as misidentifications of real phenomena, which is to say an optical illusion. We don't have gravity hills here, but we do have the standard Emily's Bridge sort of Romeo and Juliet style story. I can't remember the exact township in which the actual Emily's Bridge is supposed to be. We have the typical disappearances location. We have Glastonbury Mountain, part of the Bennington Triangle, which also includes the general region, Salem and so forth. It's this rather large, spooky triangle of land. It is a spooky area. It is a forsaken location. The number of disappearances specifically located in and around this one rather small area does defy a normal explanation. However, people have dragged so many other peripheral mythologies into it. You've got the native lore. Native lore talks about stones that swallow people, sort of the Victorian or pre-industrial era lore or industrial era lore talks about seeing like will-o'-the-wisps, fireballs, disembodied spirits on the mountain. Modern lore is like serial killer, UFO abduction, something like that. It changes over time. The central mythology isn't necessarily even something you can really get at, specifically because it's been transformed over time. You get this with lake monsters. I mean, every lake in Vermont supposedly has some sort of weird fish or monster or spirit or something attached to it. A lot of forsaken locations. Any place, David Politis in Missing 411, I think this may be an example of a slight bias on his part. His work is still very good. Some of it does defy a rational explanation. I will admit that. I definitely want to obtain all of his works and read them in depth. But one thing that he notes is that a lot of the locations that appear to have abnormally high numbers of disappearances have names like Devil's Peak or Satan's Pass or something like that, something spooky. Suicide Hill, Murder Valley, something like that. That is a little odd. Because in many cases you have the naming of these locations, but you've already had legends from antiquity, practically from native lore that predate the use of these kind of spooky terms. The terms appear to be based on those sort of anecdotes from what you would call the standard Indian lore, but at the same time it predates even colonial contact in at some times. As far as this state goes, the Connecticut Valley was settled in the 1600s. There were already people here. This side of the state wasn't really more than, it didn't have more than a rudimentary establishment until the 1800s. It's not quite as old. You can even see this in the design of the townships. You have more of the sort of post-Civil War, antebellum, or later period grid structure. Here in Rutland you have that, up in Burlington you have that, as opposed to the other side where you have sort of a very European spider's web looking setup to many of the townships that arose there. Woodstock has one of the most interesting legends. I used to live in Woodstock. According to local legend, there is actually a vampire buried in the very middle underneath a big stone slab in the middle of the park there. The fact that there probably is a corpse buried there is a very real fact, because Woodstock was one of the many townships stricken with sort of the post-witch trials area brought forth a new worry, which was vampirism, specifically because of consumption, because of tuberculosis. It was epidemic at the time, and due to the nature of the disease, the wasting away, they would disinter corpses and find, because they didn't know much about the decomposition process, they would find the corpse wasn't just a grinning skeleton, that there was sort of blood dripping down its face. They assumed that these were vampires. It was a very strange time in American history. It took hold in Europe as well. Woodstock was one of the main epicenters for this. When consumption moved through, yes, there were people that were considered vampires at the time. One of these is probably buried in the middle of the green. If they were to lift up the sort of paving stones, they probably would find an iron coffin with a skeleton in it below a giant slab of stone. They probably would. Because this is the sort of practice at that time that was common. But it's an urban legend from that time period. It has to do with a tuberculosis epidemic. They simply labeled it as a form of vampirism. They thought that vampires were amongst them, causing a miasmus in the same way that people thought that grim reapers out in the fields were causing the Black Death many, many centuries before. But it's an interesting piece of history. Look up Woodstock vampires if you want to know more. Very strange, far stranger, and far more modern, far more closely related to sort of the Bram Stoker-ish imagery of the vampire that most people know of today than the original mythology from, Wallachia or someplace like that dealt with, a power-mad dictator who impaled tens of thousands of people trying to maintain the sovereignty of a relatively small backwards principality north of the Ottoman Empire, sort of in this Hungarian, Transylvanian region. That's the more authentic story upon which some of the imagery is based, but really when we're talking about the Americanized vampire, we're talking about tuberculosis epidemics, not Vlad the Impaler. I think most people don't even understand this. They think it's based lock, stock, and barrel on sort of this Romanian legend, and it's really not. That's more political, it's more social, it's more based. Actually, in reality, Vlad was crazy and probably did dip his bread into the blood of his victims that was gathered from all of these stakes that he had people impaled on. That didn't happen in the Americas, though. Here it was all about people didn't understand how tuberculosis was transferred from person to person. I believe there have been several books written upon sort of the New England phenomena around that time of these outbreaks of tuberculosis and how people were worried that vampires were attacking those around them. Many times what you would get, again, somebody would get tuberculosis and waste away and die. Another person within the family got it. They were worried, the deceased is coming back to haunt us. They disinter the corpse. Again, the corpse was, perhaps bloated or something like that, but hadn't fully decomposed. They didn't realize. You lock someone in a box, put them 6 feet under, it takes them longer to rot than if they're just laying out in the woods. They're used to seeing animal carcasses and stuff decompose, and within a couple of days, there's basically nothing but a skeleton with some maggots around it. So when they see that the corpse that they had buried didn't decompose in that manner, they were at a loss to explain it. And so they would compare that to the other corpses that were just skeletons and say, well, something's amiss here. This person is coming back every night and leaving their coffin, and they would check the nails, and it looked like the nails had grown. They would check the hair, it looked like the hair had grown. The corpse hadn't decomposed the way they thought it was supposed to decompose, and they would say it was a vampire. It was spreading this miasmatic disease, this tuberculosis, by biting people, and the mark of blood upon tuberculosis victims, of course, and they're coughing up blood and vomiting blood and generally wasting away and becoming anemic. It seemed to fit the symptoms that they observed, and so they said it's a vampire. So there's a little bit about some of the Vermont cryptids, mythology, stuff like that. There's a lot more within this state, but these are some of the more notable ideas. Again, the Pigman and Emily's Bridge, the standard urban legends. The misconstrued Indian legends of the Champlain monster, which nonetheless, I will admit, the possibility does exist. Yes, there could be a pod of freshwater whales that evolved there. The lake is large enough. It's possible. So, seagoing sturgeons that adapted to freshwater, yes, absolutely possible. Abnormally large lake sturgeons, yes. Misidentifications of a moose as the horse's head moving through the water. Tourists don't necessarily know what a moose is or how large it is. Floating logs. I'm sure it's everything under the sun. Some central theme is there that explains the rumors of a monster there. I am tempted to believe that we're talking about, a 20-foot sturgeon that's been there for the last century or something entirely possible. So it would be a lake monster. It'd be something that they don't know what it is. It's abnormally large. It is frightening to the average person. Naturally, yes, we could class this as a monster. One that we could rationalize, but one which we can't prove is rational at the moment. And then, of course, we've got, the Bennington Triangle stuff. That's fairly well known. And then the vampire stuff is really, those two are the big ones other than Champ that we really have within this state. But yeah, I want to see mythology stuff from other people, from their states and their nations. I love this shit. I tried to get a book on New England sort of cryptids and mythology and stuff. There's one copy on eBay. This was like a year ago. I tried to order. I'm like, yes, I found it for like $3. And this is an old out-of-print book that it's hard to find. So I naturally tried to buy it, and then the seller messaged me saying, oh, well, the book was, I accidentally destroyed the book, so I can't sell it to you. I'm like, shit. Why the fuck did you do that? That would be like the ultimate find for somebody like me. I want to read more about this stuff. Now you've just denied me this nice book. And I'm a bibliophile nonetheless. So yeah, that's about all. Peace out.